The dust coated everything, the worn leather valise, the thin coat, the face of Alara. It had been a long journey, longer than any journey should feel, ending not with welcome but with a cold, appraising stare. The woman, stout and unforgiving, had looked Alara up and down on the dusty platform, her gaze settling on Alara's slight frame, her pale skin still bearing the marks of the sea voyage and the endless train ride. "Too frail," she declared, her voice like gravel. "He needs a woman who can work the land, bear strong sons." Not this the groom, a man whose face Alara barely remembered from the daguerreotype, stood silently behind his mother, his eyes avoiding hers. There was no negotiation, no discussion. The stagecoach that had brought her was already turning back, leaving Alara stranded with the pronouncement hanging in the air like a death sentence. Too frail. Abandoned before she had even truly arrived. The small town, little more than a cluster of buildings huddled against the vast, indifferent landscape, offered no refuge. Word spread fast. The mail-order bride, sent back like damaged goods. Pity mingled with scorn in the few faces she saw, a judgment she had fled a life of hardship to escape, only to find it here sharper and colder. The station master, a man with a drooping mustache and weary eyes, allowed her to stay the first night in a tiny, drafty storage shed. The air thick with the smell of coal smoke and mice. Beyond the town, the land rose into hills, stark and imposing, promising nothing but emptiness. The wind, a constant companion, whispered tales of loneliness. Despair settled deep in her bones, heavier than any fatigue. She had nowhere to go. The money sent for her passage was spent. To go back was unthinkable. The life she'd left held only grim servitude. To stay, how? With what? She curled into herself on the hard floor, the rough wool of her coat scratching her cheek, the shame and fear a suffocating blanket. This was it. The end of the line. On the third day, after the station master had politely but firmly indicated her time was up, Alara walked. She followed the dusty road leading away from the town, towards the hills, not with purpose, but because staying felt like waiting for something terrible to happen. The sun beat down, relentless, but the wind was still cold, finding the gaps in her inadequate clothing. Her stomach ached with emptiness. She thought of the descriptions in the advertisements she had answered, promising a new start, a home, a husband willing to build a life. Lies, all lies. The road grew fainter, becoming little more than tracks in the dry earth. She saw movement in the distance, a lone rider on a large horse, moving with slow, deliberate purpose across the higher ground. She didn't wave, didn't call out. She was dirt, forgotten, unworthy of notice. The rider, a man of immense size even at this distance, continued on, seemingly oblivious. Alara sank down beside a rock formation, the sparse brush offering little cover from the wind. Tears, dry and hot, traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. Too frail. The words echoed, a branding iron on her soul. The rider disappeared over a ridge. The emptiness of the land mirrored the emptiness within her. She closed her eyes, wishing herself away. When she opened them, the shadows were lengthening. The man was back, closer this time, his horse a dark shape against the dying light. He stopped a distance away, silhouetted against the ridge. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just watched. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. Who was he? Another judgment? Another threat? He remained there for a long moment, unmoving, before turning his horse and riding away into the dusk. Alara shivered, though not just from the cold. The following morning, Alara found a small, battered canvas bag left near the rocks where she had rested. Inside were 2 hard biscuits, a piece of dried meat, and a tin canteen filled with cool water. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. She looked towards the hills, towards the direction the rider had gone. Was it him? The silent, imposing man? She hesitated, her pride warring with her desperate hunger. Hunger won. The food was plain, almost tasteless, but it was sustenance. It was life. It was the first kindness she had received in days, given without expectation or demand. She stayed near the rock formation for another day, the bagged food stretching meagerly. She saw the rider again, distant, always on the higher ground, seeming to patrol the vast, empty landscape. He never came close, never spoke. His silence was less menacing than the town's whispers, less cruel than the words of the groom's mother. On the fourth day since leaving the town, Alara saw him again. This time, he was not on horseback but walking, carrying a large, irregular-shaped bundle on his shoulder. He was heading towards the rising ground, not directly towards her, but nearby. She watched him, fascination overcoming her fear. He was enormous, a mountain of a man in rough, dark clothing, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of immense strength. He reached a small, relatively flat shelf partway up one of the hills, a place overlooking the plains below. He dropped the bundle logs, she realized, and stood for a moment, surveying the area. Then he began to work. He cleared the brush with powerful swings of an axe she hadn't seen him carry, moved rocks that looked too heavy for one man, and began to lay the logs. He worked methodically, relentlessly, in the silent, solitary way of the land itself. He did not look at her. He acted as if she wasn't there, yet his presence filled the landscape. It was a deliberate, tangible action in this place of inaction and despair. It was building. She watched him for hours, a silent witness to his solitary labor. The structure was small, just a simple frame initially, but it was something. As the sun began to set, he stopped, gathered a few smaller pieces of wood, and built a small, contained fire, cooking something in a dented pan. The smell drifted down on the wind, making her stomach clench. He ate alone, silhouetted by the firelight against the deepening twilight. Alara remained by her rock, unseen, or perhaps simply unacknowledged. He offered no invitation, no gesture. Yet his work, his presence, felt different from the cold indifference of the town. It felt like a refusal to yield to the emptiness. The thought sparked something within her, a tiny ember of defiance against the pronouncement of her frailty. She was still afraid, still alone, but watching him build, watching him simply be in this harsh place, stirred a flicker of resolve. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to not disappear entirely. The next morning, Alara, driven by a hunger that was as much for purpose as for food, walked towards where he had worked. She kept her distance, approaching cautiously. He was already there, continuing his labor. He paused as she drew nearer, straightening up, his eyes, dark and unreadable, meeting hers for the first time at close range. He was weathered, his face lined, his beard dark and thick. There was a quiet intensity about him that was intimidating, yet lacked malice. "Morning," he said, his voice deep and resonant. The first words she had heard directed at her in days that weren't a judgment. "Found the fixings?" Alara nodded, unable to find her voice. He gestured towards the structure, the rough frame taking shape. "Building a cabin," he stated, stating the obvious with quiet finality. He didn't explain why here, why now, or why in front of the woman abandoned. He simply stated the fact. Emboldened slightly by his lack of hostility, and desperate to understand, Alara managed to ask, "Why? Why here?" He turned back to his work, picking up an axe. "High ground," he grunted, his movements economical. "See the country. Less chance of being washed out or surprised." He didn't elaborate. His focus was on the wood, the nails, the sheer physical effort. Alara watched him for a while longer, then tentatively picked up a fallen branch, snapping it in two. She didn't know what she was doing, but staying still felt impossible. He glanced at her action but said nothing. She began clearing smaller debris from around the site, pulling up stubborn weeds, her hands quickly becoming scratched and sore. It was insignificant work compared to his, but it was doing. He continued building, occasionally stopping to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of a massive hand. The sun climbed higher. Her stomach rumbled. He stopped work, went to his small fire pit, and began preparing food again. This time, he prepared 2 portions, handing one to her on a tin plate without a word of invitation. Simply an action. Alara took it, her hands trembling slightly. She ate, sitting on a rock, watching him eat his own meal in silence. The shared, silent meal felt less lonely than eating alone. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Alara would walk up to the site in the morning. Jethro, she learned his name through a passing question he asked about whether she'd been called Alara or something else, giving his own name in return, would be there already working. She would find small tasks she could manage. Clearing stones, fetching water from a nearby spring he showed her, sorting nails. He rarely spoke and she spoke even less, but the silence between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of judgment or indifference, but of shared focus. She watched his hands, calloused and strong, shaping the wood, fitting the pieces together with surprising care. He was building a proper structure, stout and weatherworthy, not just a temporary shelter. It was slow, grueling work, high up on the exposed hillside, constantly battling the wind and the uneven ground. But it was progress. Alara felt a different kind of ache now, the ache of tired muscles, of sunburned skin, an ache that felt earned, not inflicted. She was no longer simply enduring. She was participating. Jethro, despite his size and imposing presence, never made her feel smaller or weaker. He simply let her work alongside him, accepting her contribution, however small, without comment or criticism. He saw her not as frail, but simply as there doing what she could. This quiet acceptance was a balm to her wounded spirit. The frame rose higher. Walls began to take shape. Jethro taught her simple things, how to hammer a nail without bending it, how to carry wood more efficiently. He didn't offer praise, but a brief, assessing nod felt like a commendation. Alara's internal monologue shifted from despair to determination. This place, initially a symbol of her abandonment, was slowly becoming something else. A place of effort, of building, of quiet, shared existence. She still didn't know his full story, or why he was doing this, building a cabin high in the hills and allowing a stranded stranger to work alongside him. He remained a man of few words, his past as shrouded as the distant mountains on the horizon. But his actions were clear. He was building, and by allowing her to help, he was, in a way he never articulated, building a place where she was not only tolerated but needed, however slightly. The shared labor, the shared silence under the vast sky, was forging a fragile, unspoken bond. It was not the life the advertisement had promised, but it was becoming a life nonetheless, one built from the ground up, piece by laborious piece. The cabin was nearing completion when the weather turned. A storm, sudden and violent, swept in from the north, bringing with it a bitter wind and driving rain that quickly turned to sleet. They had taken shelter inside the partially finished structure, huddled by the small, smoky fire Jethro managed to build. The thin walls offered little protection, the wind howling through the gaps, tearing at the tarps Jethro had rigged on the open sides. Alara shivered uncontrollably, the damp seeping into her clothes. Jethro sat opposite her, equally exposed but seemingly impervious to the cold, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. The vulnerability of their position, high on the exposed hillside, was starkly apparent. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar, "the land remembers you ain't in charge." It wasn't a complaint, just an observation. As the storm raged, another sound cut through the wind, the distressed bleating of sheep, followed by shouts. Jethro was instantly on his feet, moving towards the opening. "Rustlers," he stated, his voice hard, his face grim. Alara's blood ran cold. She knew rustling was a brutal business, and they were isolated, exposed. Jethro pulled a rifle from where it leaned against a wall. "Stay here," he ordered, his eyes meeting hers, the unspoken command clear. He disappeared out into the storm. Alara huddled by the fire, her heart pounding. She heard shouts, the crack of the rifle, the panicked bleating of sheep. The sounds were muffled by the storm but terrifyingly real. Fear threatened to consume her, but something else warred with it, a fierce, protective instinct for this fragile shelter they had built, for the quiet man who had given her refuge. She couldn't fight men with rifles, but she could do something. She remembered Jethro mentioning that the tarps needed securing. She grabbed a hammer and some nails he had left within reach. Hands shaking, she crawled towards the openings, the wind whipping at her, the sleet stinging her face. She hammered nails blindly, desperately, trying to secure the flapping canvas against the force of the storm, trying to make their flimsy walls a little sturdier. It was a small, probably futile act against the chaos outside, but it was action. It was her refusing to be frail, refusing to hide and wait for rescue or ruin. She heard a cry, a guttural shout, and then the sounds of struggle moved away from the cabin. Silence save for the storm, stretched agonizingly. Then, Jethro reappeared in the opening, soaked and grim, a cut bleeding above his eye. He leaned against the frame, breathing heavily. "They're gone," he said, his voice rough. "Got some of the flock, but they didn't get to the main herd." His eyes fell on Alara, on the hammer still clutched in her hand, on the slightly more secured tarps. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He didn't say anything about her actions, but he didn't need to. The storm lessened by dawn, leaving behind a landscape glistening with ice and mud. Jethro tended to his cut and the injured sheep he had managed to save. Alara worked alongside him, no longer hesitant, cleaning wounds, her hands steady despite the cold. The shared danger had stripped away the last vestiges of their awkwardness. They had faced a threat together, each doing what they could, in their own way. As the sun rose, casting long shadows, Alara looked at the cabin, battered but standing. It wasn't just a structure of wood and nails. It was a testament to their resilience, to the fact that even in the most barren of places, something could be built. Jethro caught her gaze. "It'll do," he said quietly, looking at the cabin, then at her. It wasn't much, but it was approval, acknowledgement. The following weeks were spent finishing the cabin, making it weathertight. Alara plastered the gaps with mud, helped build rudimentary furniture, and gathered firewood. Her body grew stronger, her skin tanned and weathered by the sun and wind. The frail woman had vanished, replaced by someone capable, determined. Jethro remained a man of few words, but the silence between them was now comfortable, filled with shared history and unspoken understanding. They ate together, worked together, watched the sun set over the vast plains from their high perch. There was no declaration of affection, no promise of forever, only the quiet, solid fact of their shared existence in this place they had built together. Alara knew this wasn't the life society expected, not the one advertised in a catalog, but it was theirs. It was a life forged in hardship, bound by necessity and mutual respect. She had come seeking a home, a husband, and instead had found something quieter, deeper, built not on shallow promises, but on the solid foundation of shared survival and the silent language of acceptance. High in the hills, far from the judgments of the world, she had found her strength, her place, and a silent partner with whom to face the vast, unpredictable country ahead. This remote cabin, built piece by piece, was more a home than any grand house could have been, because it was built not just of wood, but of resilience and the quiet understanding that had grown between two unlikely souls against the harsh backdrop of the unforgiving land.